Good afternoon, everybody. It's 5:17. If we could go ahead and find our seats so that we can get started. Good afternoon and welcome to one and all. My name is Father Mark Doherty. I'm the President Rector of St. Patrick's Seminary, and on behalf of Archbishop Cordileone, the Archbishop of San Francisco, who is right here in the second row, hiding. On behalf of Archbishop Cordileone, the faculty, the staff, the seminarians of St. Patrick's, we'd like to welcome all of you to our beautiful campus, our beautiful home, and to this lecture event. 2 years ago, this month, when I booked Dr. Atlas, I hadn't recalled that it was precisely this month, but it was 2 years ago this month in March of 2021. We here at St. Patrick's had the privilege of welcoming Dr. Jay Bhattacharya to this podium to deliver a lecture on the incredible damage being inflicted on society as a result of ill-conceived lockdown policies imposed by governments around the world. While most lockdown policies have been lifted since then, the importance of the topic has not waned, nor has it passed. Quite the contrary. As a result, my colleagues and I here at St. Patrick's deemed it fitting, even necessary, to continue the conversation, a conversation which is not only about public health policy, but more fundamentally is about the underlying ethical framework that ought to shape policy decisions and the conversation surrounding the crafting of these policies. And to that end, therefore, today we have the privilege of welcoming to this podium Dr. Scott Atlas. Allow me to introduce Dr. Atlas. Not that he needs much introduction probably, but go through our paces here. Dr. Atlas is the Robert Wesson Senior Fellow in Health Policy at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. He investigates the impact of government and the private sector on access, quality, and pricing in healthcare, trends in healthcare innovation, and key economic and civil liberties issues related to health policies. He's a frequent policy advisor to policymakers in the United States and other countries. He has served as senior advisor for health policy to several candidates for president, members of the U.S. Congress, and health agencies. As we all know, from August through November of 2020, he served as special advisor to the President of the United States and a member of the White House Coronavirus Task Force. Before his policy appointment at Hoover, Dr. Atlas was professor and chief of neuroradiology at Stanford University Medical Center for 14 years and in academic medicine for 25 years. Dr. Atlas is the author of more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications, 200 policy papers, and numerous books, including most recently, A Plague Upon Our House, My Fight at the Trump White House to Stop COVID from Destroying America, published by Post Hill Press. Without further ado, I give you Dr. Scott Atlas.
Thank you. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Father Mark and Archbishop Cordileone, for inviting me here, and it's great to see a lot of friends and familiar faces. It's not always the case when I speak. Today I'd like to go through sort of a quasi-academic presentation, so I'm going to show a lot of data, a lot of slides. I think it's important to keep talking about the facts because the facts either are not well known, were suppressed, or are now being denied. And as an ethical society, the first step is truth. So I'm going to go through that and raise the issues about what I see as how to go forward or what we need to consider when we go forward out of this pandemic, because it's not really the pandemic anymore. It's not the lockdowns. It's what was exposed as fundamental issues in our society. And with that, I entitled this presentation, A Pandemic of Failed Leadership, Will Trust Return? And of course, this is one of the big losses now that we have to grapple with is we've lost trust in key institutions, as well as I think in each other. To live in a civilized society, you need to have a civil behavior relationship with people in your society. But the sort of subtitle of the talk, or the other way to look at this, is Will an Ethical Society Return? And as I will illustrate, it's sad to see what happened, but I think we in many ways lost our moral compass, our ethical compass as a free society during the management of the pandemic. I'll start out with this Huxley quote, which is, "Facts do not cease to exist because they are ignored." Well, what are the facts? First, we know what was claimed. In spring of 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, SARS-2 virus had a far higher fatality rate than the flu by several orders of magnitude, that everyone had a significant risk to die, that no one had immunity because the virus was new, that everyone was equally dangerous and spreads the infection, that asymptomatic people are the main drivers of the infection, that locking down will stop or eliminate the virus, masks protect everyone and stop the spread of the virus, and immune protection can only be found from a vaccine. All of these claims were false. And it's not that they were false now because it's learned information or new data has come out. They were known to be false in the spring of 2020, and that's when people like me started to point that out. The other fact is what happened in the management of the pandemic. What happened was the U.S. enacted what I call the Birx-Fauci lockdowns. I call it that because Deborah Birx in 2020 was the White House Task Force coordinator. In that capacity, she was in charge of the federal policy. That was delegated to her, and you could argue that was a failure of leadership to delegate authority and not just use her as an advisor, but be that as it may, she wrote personally all the official federal guidelines to all the state governors. She met with all the local health officials in almost all the states, often with the vice president. She was the coronavirus policy from the White House. Anthony Fauci was not in charge of anything, and that's a sort of a shocking thing to say, but in the Trump White House, he was not officially in charge, but he was the most visible, most influential face of the White House policy. He was on TV most days, on podcasts, on radio. He was identified as the face of the federal policy, and in that capacity had a tremendous amount of influence. And later, when President Biden was inaugurated, he was officially chief medical advisor to the president. And the original policy, as everyone knows, was 15 days to slow the spread. And that, of course, was rational. If you thought that the goal here was to make sure hospitals could function, they weren't overwhelmed, we could treat people with serious illness as well as with COVID, anything that could be done to slow the spread was the goal. There was no explicit goal. In fact, it was never stated that this would reduce deaths or reduce cases, because it couldn't. Unfortunately, that sort of flattened the curve mentality of the cases almost immediately became stop all cases at all costs. And how did they propose to do this, Birx and Fauci? They proposed it by instituting lockdowns. And lockdowns meant closing schools, shutdowns of businesses, limits on medical care, and a host of restrictions, mandates, and quarantines. And those policies were implemented. And those policies were implemented under two different administrations. And the results of those policies is essentially a failure. Why is it a failure? Because more than 1 million American deaths were attributed to the virus under that policy, executed and implemented throughout almost the entire country. And that policy not only failed, but it also caused primarily death and destruction, particularly in working class and poor families. This is the data from a website that is used all over the world. It's called Our World in Data. And this shows during the entire pandemic under 2 administrations, with January 20th indicated as the change of administration there, January 2021, how the United States did in COVID deaths per million people. And we can see, when you look at the line for the U.S., A, it did poorly compared to other peer nations, and B, the slope of that line is straight. And you don't have to be a math genius to understand that that means that the rate of accumulated deaths did not change under 2 administrations, even after the introduction of vaccination. This is not a political statement. Both administrations had the same result in COVID deaths per million, no matter what you hear. What that means is that the lockdowners and the academic experts who recommended lockdowns and demonized the alternative own the outcomes. Their policies were implemented. If you think their policies were a success, if you are happy with the results of the United States policy on COVID, then you would congratulate Drs. Fauci and Birx and the academics who recommended the lockdowns. If you think that the outcomes were not good, those are the people you have to speak to. The lockdowns were not previously recommended. No one has paid attention to this fact, that standard pandemic management was articulated and published by the people attributed to getting rid of smallpox and experts in pandemic management, Henderson and colleagues, 15 years before this pandemic. And the standard mitigation measures in their article that was accepted as standard were the following. All who are ill are requested to remain isolated at home or in the hospital, but everyone else should continue to come to work. Closing schools for longer than the first 2 weeks at the beginning of an epidemic is not warranted. Canceling or postponing large meetings would not have any significant effect. There is no basis for recommending quarantines, either of groups or individuals, and screening passengers at borders or closing air and rail transportation. Those actions are not effective. They are not recommended. This was completely violated in an unprecedented way with this pandemic. That was the standard pandemic management. So the actual policy, the standard policy, was doing what's called targeted protection, making sure you protect the high-risk people and let everyone else function. Instead, we locked down society. The safer alternative, which was called targeted protection by me and others, was announced and written about in national media in March of 2020. Johnny Anides, my friend and colleague at Stanford, David Katz wrote about it in the New York Times, and I wrote about it independently in the same 10-day period in March of 2020. And what did we say? We said, as Martin Kulldorff chimed in because he couldn't get his papers published in the United States, so his was delayed and was written in CNN Espanol in April of 2020, we should increase the protection of the people known to be high risk. Every medical student in the world understood from day one who were the most likely to be high risk. Elderly people with multiple underlying illnesses, frail people. That's typically who's at high risk from viruses. And we said, target and increase the protection of them and reopen society and stop destroying low-risk people and children. That was ignored. And then 7 months later, the Great Barrington Declaration by my friend and colleague Jay Bhattacharya, Sunetra Gupta of Oxford, and Martin Kulldorff of Harvard wrote the same thing, and they codified that philosophy. And the reason that that document is so important is because it gave people something to say, yes, I agree with that. These are people who are very famous, very credentialed. They're not serving in the Trump administration, and we can agree with that. That was ignored. It was known for decades that when you have an economic shutdown, like a lockdown, you're going to kill people. Yet it wasn't being spoken about. And in spring of 2020, I was called up, this is months before I went to Washington, by an economist at University of Chicago, John Burge, and he said, Scott, you're writing about the pandemic. They're killing people with the lockdowns, particularly poor people. We need to write about this. None of the famous economists who I work with at Stanford and Hoover were writing about this, and I'm not an economist, but I said, okay, because this economist at University of Chicago wanted to get this out there. And so we wrote a piece in May of 2020, and what we said, what we calculated, was that the spring lockdown of 2020 alone lost double the number of life years that the virus caused. And we even said in there very clearly that we must stop the loss of life from the economic lockdown, not just from COVID, because public health guidance is about public health, not about one single disease. And we need to increase the protection of the high-risk people because the high-risk people were not being protected enough in the lockdowns. And this somehow was escaping the attention. The last sentence in this excerpted paragraph says, when the next pandemic inevitably arises, we need to remember these lessons and follow the policies that consider the lives of all Americans from the outset. I'm still hoping that happens because the next pandemic is inevitable. How did this new mitigation strategy for pandemics get impressed upon the public? Why did the public believe this? When I speak all over the country, people with just simply common sense are saying this made no sense to them. Well, it was introduced and pushed by two big lies. And those lies were, number one, if you're against the lockdowns, you're choosing the economy over lives. And this, of course, is sort of a sinful statement and accusation, and of course it's contrary to economics data for decades that, again, when you have a severe economic downturn, you kill people. It was lives versus lives. And the second lie was that somehow if you're speaking against lockdowns, you're calling for the infection to spread without any mitigation. Let it rip, the so-called herd immunity strategy. And of course, that was an overt lie. No one ever recommended letting it spread without any mitigation. I was in the White House where that article came out in the Washington Post that says that that's what I was professing and others. And no one ever said that in the White House. It was never even discussed. The President of the United States never even mentioned the words. In fact, he misspoke and said herd mentality when he was talking about things. This is called propaganda. And I put the word propaganda in New York Times font for a reason. Now, quickly, I'm going to go through some statistics here. What's the risk and for whom? The original World Health Organization said that the risk for death, infection fatality rate, was 3.4%, which is a horrendous and very fear-inducing number. And the truth was that was orders of magnitude off, as shown as early as 2020 by John Ioannidis and colleagues. Age was the most important risk factor for COVID death. The mean age for death was 80, and 80% of deaths occurred in people over 65. And when we look at that 2020 data, this is a review published by the Ioannidis group in January of this year, looking at the data from 2020, when the virus was in its most lethal form with no vaccine. So at the worst part of this pandemic, you see that the infection fatality rate for young people is less than or equal to influenza. That's a fact. That's not an opinion. And if you say that, you're not crazy. That's actually the truth. It's extremely low risk for young people. And there is another factor here, which was it's thousands-fold more risky for old people. So this was a peculiar virus in that way. And it was also a blessing to know that young people, that our children, did not have high risk. For perspective, the age of death from COVID, if you can see the slide on the chart at the bottom, in most countries was older than the age of life expectancy. That's not to minimize that people died from COVID, okay? That's true, but there's a clinical perspective that you never heard from Dr. Fauci on TV during 2020. And the second point on this slide is that 2/3 of COVID deaths occurred beyond life expectancy. That's in 2020. That's when the virus was at its most lethal time and when there was no vaccine. The other point you never heard anyone talk about was this issue of comorbidities. In the United States, this is US data, 2/3 of people who died from COVID had greater than or equal to 6 underlying illnesses. Not 1, not treated high blood pressure alone, but 6 underlying illnesses. This was a disease that was clearly very, very dangerous, but mainly for people who were very, very frail. It's not true that no one else died. I'm not trying to say that, but in general, statistically, that's the case. Now, here, lockdowns were implemented, and I say this slide, lockdowns were actually lockdowns. Why do I say that? Because when I was sitting in the White House, Dr. Birx, when it became clear, I was the only one saying the lockdowns were killing people, and they're not working. And eventually, lockdowns became a dirty word because it was obvious that they weren't working. This is by October 2020, internally in Washington. And so Dr. Birx said to me at one of these meetings, well, Scott, no one on the task force is for lockdowns. Okay. And I said, well, are you for closing schools and businesses? And she said, yes. This is a room full of 30 people here in this meeting. But these things are indelible, by the way. Are you for limiting medical care for non-COVID? She said, yes. I said, are you for limiting family group visits and seeing your elderly parents? She said, yes. Are you for restricting personal movement, for curfews, for quarantining asymptomatic healthy people? And she said, yes. And I said, well, then you are for lockdowns. And this still is denied even today. You'll see Dr. Fauci, Dr. Birx on TV saying they were never for shutting down. Did lockdowns work? No, they didn't work. They failed, and this is the data. And I'm showing you the actual articles, and I'm happy to distribute these slides if anyone wants to see them. This is Bjorn Skov's study, March 2021, 24 European countries, quote, more severe lockdown policies have not been associated with lower mortality. That's the purpose of the lockdowns, was to stop people from dying. This is Ben David and colleagues at Stanford, January 2021. We did not find significant benefits on case growth of restrictive non-pharmaceutical interventions or shelter-in-place or lockdowns. That means that it's not just that the deaths weren't stopped, the case growth was not stopped by the lockdowns. This is National Bureau of Economic Research, USC, and RAND Institute, June 2021. The lockdowns were assessed in 43 countries and in all the states. Not only did lockdowns not work, they led to an increase in death. And it says increase in excess death. Excess death means deaths beyond and above what you would have if there were no pandemic. Okay, so that includes whether it was miscalculated as a COVID death or whatever. This eliminates all those variables. Lockdowns cause more death. Longer shelter in place, excess deaths increased. Earlier onset lockdowns, more excess deaths. And in fact, in their data, the excess deaths were falling before the lockdowns, and when the lockdowns were instituted, the deaths increased. You're not going to hear that on CNN. This is Herbie, Johns Hopkins, January 2022, a meta-analysis. That means analyzing all the published data, and they showed lockdowns had little or no effect on COVID mortality, but they had imposed enormous economic and social costs, and, quote, lockdown policies are ill-founded and should be rejected as a pandemic policy instrument. Remember, we knew that for 15 years. This didn't really need to be stated, but it was stated again by Johns Hopkins Group. And then this is a study in February of 2023 published by the University of Chicago and others, analyzed the states, and they did a quantitative assessment of the pandemic management on 3 criteria: death, economic disruption, and education. And here's what they did. Here's what their results showed. The states that did the best, in blue here, were among the states that opened the earliest, and I'm circling here South Dakota and Florida because these governors, Kristi Noem and Ron DeSantis, took a lot of heat for opening up. And the states that did the worst, in the bottom here, are Illinois, California, New Mexico, New York, Washington, D.C., and New Jersey. So if you hear from some governor in a Western state that we happen to be sitting in, that California did well, that's completely contrary to the data. How could lockdowns directly kill people? This is how. This is data from 2020, by the way. Half of 650,000 cancer patients in the United States during 2020 skipped their chemotherapy because they were told it was too dangerous to go into a hospital or medical center. 40 to 50% of stroke patients and heart attack patients did not call an ambulance. They were told to be afraid of going into a hospital. Organ transplants from living donors were down 85% from the previous year. The diseases don't go away. I don't think I have to even say that, right? But these people were told to skip their medical care. And by the way, the hospitals and medical centers were closed to some extent for non-COVID disease. 2/3 to actually 3/4 of cancer screenings didn't get done during 2020. What happens to those people? The cancers don't get invisible, the cancers progress. They come in, they get worse disease, more distant spread, more severe pain, and death. How did the world do when you look at excess deaths? And this is the most relevant calculation by any epidemiologist. And of course, as you may have heard, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I know how to read data. And the excess death increase for the entire pandemic in all the developed nations of the world, the country that did the best is a country called Sweden. Feynman said, it does not matter who you are, or how smart you are, or what title you have, or how many of you there are, and certainly not how many papers your site has published. If your prediction is wrong, then your hypothesis is wrong, period. Now, I want to talk about lockdowns and school closures as a measure of an ethical society, because I think it's not just about the statistics here. The risk to healthy children is low. This is a fact. It was known from the beginning. In fact, it was known from all over the world, and that is actually why the rest of the world opened their schools for the fall of 2020. The United States was the outlier in that. But the California data here, this is from September 2021, and the data is still the same today, that while there were about 14% of cases in children, 0% of COVID deaths. It doesn't mean 0 deaths, but 0% of COVID deaths in California were in children. This is Florida data. Case fatality rate, if you're sick enough to go to see a doctor, how many people die? 0% case fatality rate if you're under 16. In fact, in Florida data, and this is still true today because I just looked yesterday, for the entire pandemic, 0% case fatality rate in Florida if you're under 30 from COVID. The risk from children is low, and it was known to be low since spring of 2020 from dozens of studies all over the world, very sophisticated genetic studies from Iceland, from Norway, Sweden, Spain, the Netherlands, Ireland, Switzerland, France, Australia, Germany, Greece, South Korea, and the United Kingdom. Not only was the spread from children low, but when schools were open, there was no increased community spread, there was no increased risk of teachers without any mitigation in schools whatsoever. So when I went to Washington, the first thing I did was, okay, I want to push for opening schools. This is something that is irrefutable, the data on this. And so, and I said, well, healthy children do not have a high risk from the virus. We know this. Harms of closing in-person schools are enormous. We know that. You don't have to be a parent to understand that kids learn a lot more than book learning in school. Not just physical activity, not just a conflict resolution, but in lower socioeconomic groups, kids get their most nutritious meal in school. We find hearing and visual loss in school. There's all kinds of things, not to mention that's the #1 agency for detecting child abuse in school. And then the third point I made to people in the White House was, to me, this is my opinion, there was nothing more important to a civilized society than educating our children. It was also known that online learning was a gross failure. This is data from 2020 spring school closures. There was an explosion of failing grades in schools. Even Stanford's Education Center said the findings on learning losses are chilling. The losses beyond learning were known to everybody, as I've articulated, and by the way, all of these losses, all of these harms to children are worse for minorities and poor children. This was the event that I convinced President Trump and others to hold. We had parents, we had educators, we had parents of handicapped children, special needs kids, talking about the obvious data on why we need to open schools. That was August 12, 2020, and America closed the schools that month for the entire fall term, with some rare exceptions. For instance, Governor DeSantis of Florida opened schools. America closed its schools. What happened? Okay, well, this is what happened. This is medical claims. This is not a survey, by the way. This is actual data of visits to doctors that were claimed on insurance compared to the previous year when there was no pandemic. And so this is a graph here showing that all hospital claims for teenagers went down, medical claims, because medical care was interrupted. So that's expected. But what wasn't anticipated by these people was there was an explosion of claims over the previous year in mental illness in teenagers. This is self-harm visits in teenagers. The green line is 2020, and the purple line here is 2019, no pandemic. Self-harm visits are when teenagers are slashing their wrists or putting cigarettes out on their skin. From the isolation, double to triple self-harm visits in teenagers compared to the pre-pandemic year. Psychiatric illness in college kids, month to month compared to 2019, anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, explosion. This is not from the virus. This is from the isolation. This is an intervention that caused this, a voluntary policy. This is drug abuse in teenagers, explosion, overdoses, substance use disorders during the lockdowns compared to the previous year. And of course, since then, we've looked at the data, and this is the headline: largest score declines in math at grades 4 and grade 8 in the history of recording the assessments. The lockdowns hurt low-income families and, relatively speaking, spared the affluent. This is a heinous abuse of the ethics of public health guidance, to shift the burden of a disease or of dealing with a disease to the low-income families, while what Martin Kulldorff called the laptop class can sit home, order food in from DoorDash, get their stuff from Amazon. Who do you think's working in the grocery stores when there's no vaccine and a very lethal virus? And so this is what happens. This is educational progress by income group. And you'll notice during that early phase of the lockdowns, there was a more profound drop in education loss or educational progress, and a more persistent one, the lower the family income. This is change in employment by wage quartile. Again, a more profound loss and a more protracted loss of jobs in the low-income families. This is an article that was published in January of 2023. Over the next 20 years, from the unemployment alone, not from the virus, 1.2 million extra American deaths, reduced life expectancy, increased death rate, all of which disproportionately affect African Americans and women. I thought we were a society that cared about poor people and minorities and children. This is a summary of a study that was published on the state of learning loss in the world from the lockdowns and how it preferentially impacted low-income and poor children. And if you want to know who funded the study, for those of you who like to assess the value of a study by who funded it, this was funded by the World Bank, UNESCO, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they concluded that the losses were especially bad where schools were closed the longest, disproportionately affecting students from disadvantaged backgrounds, concentrated among poor students, and threatens to undermine the future of children. That's why I call lockdowns a luxury of the rich. This was a huge class war going on here. Mandela said there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. And in my opinion, America was an egregious failure here. The second thing is a measure of an ethical society are COVID vaccines in children. I'm not going to go through too much about vaccines. I think we're still grappling with the censorship of information, the lack of information, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. But specifically in children in COVID vaccines, because remember, healthy children have a minuscule risk from COVID. That's not an opinion, that's fact. Now, we know the data showed as early as August of 2021, this is a study from Israel, that the protection from recovery of COVID is equal to or better than the protection you get from vaccination without having had COVID. That sort of basic fundamental biology that I like to say is not medical school biology, it's not PhD, it's not college, it's senior year high school, probably for most of the parents in this room, it's AP biology in high school, is that you have persistent memory and protection after a viral infection that lasts sometimes forever, certainly long term. And what their data showed was not only was your protection better if you've recovered from COVID and been unvaccinated than those who were vaccinated, it's better against symptomatic infection, against all infection, against serious illness requiring hospitalization by multiple factors. It's also shown back in August of 2021 that if you have recovered from COVID and were not vaccinated, you had the same protection as if you had recovered from COVID and then were vaccinated. They proved back in 2021, August, that there was no need to get vaccinated if you've had recovery from COVID. That recovery from COVID, though, was ignored by the United States and in many ways still is, as you know. Now, what about the circulating type of COVID, of the virus that we have had for the past year and that we have now? It's not that original form, it's the so-called Omicron and Omicron variants. Here's the data on the effectiveness of the vaccines. This is Pfizer's vaccine and Moderna's vaccine, and I'm going to just say it because you probably can't see the numbers. After 60 days, the protection, this is the FDA's data, after the Pfizer vaccine and after Moderna, after 60 days, they're 4.2 to 9.8% effective. Okay? I mean, what that means is that they would never have been approved in any reasonable assessment. After 60 days, there's no protection. This is a study from New York that shows that in children, after 30 days, there is 0 to 41% protection, essentially no protection, after 30 days. If you think that you need a vaccine for protection and you think and you're going to mandate it, that means since it takes 2 weeks to get antibodies and it's gone after 30 days, you need to get a vaccine every 10 to 14 days for the rest of your life. For a variant, by the way, Omicron, that is not particularly lethal. Other countries do not recommend vaccines for children for COVID. They know the data. This is the United Kingdom's committee recommendation on children aged 12 to 15. The margin of benefit is too small to support advising vaccination of healthy teenagers. This is Finland. People under 16 who are not in a high-risk group will not be vaccinated. This is Norway. For children who are offered the vaccine but have not yet reached the adult age of making consent for themselves, parents must consent. Vaccination is voluntary. For Denmark, from July 1, 2022, it will no longer be possible for children and young people under 18 to get the vaccine. They know the same data we're supposed to know. This was the editor-in-chief of New England Journal advising the FDA in the United States. We're never going to learn how safe the vaccine is unless we start giving it. That's just the way it goes. Okay, I never thought I'd live in a country where I heard some responsible scientist say something like that. It went further. The COVID vaccines were introduced into infants. This is Moderna's announcement on Thursday, April 28th, 2022, vaccination in children 6 months to under 6 years. Remember, I've already outlined the risks to these children is extraordinarily low, and they applied for emergency use authorization. Okay, where's the public health emergency in April of 2022, first of all, and second of all, for children? How did they judge the efficacy of their vaccine? They said in individuals 6 months through 5 years, it's based on a blood test, a comparison of the antibody level. Why did they do that? That's not a clinical trial. Why didn't they say it's based on outcome of death or serious illness? Because no one in the study, including in the placebo group, not a single person, had a hospitalization or a death. So they couldn't use that. Why didn't they use clinical recovery? This is why they didn't use clinical recovery. This is their data submitted to the FDA. The protection against a clinical illness was 31 to 50% after 6 weeks. That's not enough to get approval, so they didn't use that as their criteria. Furthermore, this is the FDA's slide on what is needed for an emergency use approval. And you'll notice, number one, the disease has to cause a very serious life-threatening disease or condition. That's a definition. Okay, we already said in children that's not what this is. This is April 2022, by the way, where the lethal variants are done. And by the way, they were granted emergency use authorization in children. I say the U.S. public health ethics have disappeared. This is a quote. If a school is implementing a testing strategy, testing should be voluntary. It is unethical and illegal to test someone who does not want to be tested, including students. This was a statement that the CDC published in the fall of 2020. Yet, we have over 5,000 colleges and universities who didn't just command testing, but also mandatory vaccines in college students. Why do I say the public health ethics have disappeared? Because they literally did. This is now removed, that statement about the illegality of testing against people's wills. America's leadership is in crisis, in my view. There is an unprecedented denial of fact. The American credentialed class, our experts who we are taught to listen to, have been exposed as non-expert, politicized in many cases, and in my view, ethically deficient. School and university leaders broke the social contract with our most precious resource, our children. And the free exchange of ideas is under threat. And there's a common theme here, and that theme is the word university. The universities have failed, and the universities have been entrusted with privileged positions in the shadow here of Stanford University. We have granted, as a society, professors to be the experts for the media, in the public eye. We appoint them as government agencies directors. We let them not only get millions of taxpayer dollars to do research, they are the ones who decide what research is even done. But most importantly, we have entrusted them as teachers of critical thinking and role models for our children. That's the purpose of a college, in my view. They can learn stuff from the book. You're supposed to be taught critical thinking, which, by the way, requires different views. How else do you sort out what's right and what's wrong? Yes, the emperor's new clothes. Mackey said of all the offspring of time, error is the most ancient and is so old and familiar an acquaintance that truth, when discovered, comes upon most of us like an intruder and meets the intruder's welcome. And that is exactly what happens on university campuses, as I and others have found out. There is this cancel culture, and that cancel culture is the opposite, is the antithesis of the free exchange of ideas that universities are entrusted to uphold. And that kind of cancel culture relies on something that is really false. that we are learning, and that is the university brand. In fact, they legitimize defamation not just with the university and with official notices, but with their titles, like former dean of the School of Medicine or academic secretary to the university. This is what has been exposed, and this is what I mean by things were exposed. There were 3 medical scientists at Stanford University, John Ioannidis, myself, and Jay Bhattacharya. And we said, in almost unison, the same exact things about who's at risk, about the risk to children, about the protection of recovery, that masks do not work, that schools should be open, that lockdowns are harmful, and that we should use something called targeted protection. We said this almost in identical words. In fact, while I was in Washington, I spoke to these people every day, every other day, and yet only one of us received a censure from Stanford University. I wonder why. And I don't just say that sort of to be funny, although it is sort of funny, but if you look at the voting that's on campuses, and this is particularly true, this is Stanford University zip code, where you have to be a Stanford faculty member to live. And when you look at the Biden-Trump election, while California was 2-1 Biden to Trump, Stanford was 94.7% Biden, 3.5% Trump. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that people don't like Donald Trump. Now, even America's media, the most vicious media in the world, recognize political targeting. The Wall Street Journal editorial board itself wrote the public can be forgiven for wondering if Dr. Ellis's appointment as a White House advisor last month had made him a political target. National Review said, I was singled out because I had the, quote, temerity to join President Trump's coronavirus task force and advocate rational measures for safely reopening the economy. When the President of the United States asks you to help the country and people are dying, the answer is yes. You know, one of the other issues is that our previously revered scientific journals, the bastion of objective truth, have really dropped the ball here. In February of 2020, a group of very famous virologists wrote a letter to the editor of the journal The Lancet, one of the world's most prestigious journals. February 2020, they said, we condemn conspiracy theories that suggest that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. In February 2020, they said it was known that the lab leak was a conspiracy theory. Of course, we know very different. We knew that it couldn't have been known then. It's still being talked about today. But, you know, that was a hugely inappropriate statement. But the question is not that they made it. Why did they make that statement? And this is a very complicated answer, I think, to that. We don't really know. It's hard to judge motives, but it certainly was intended to intimidate the discussion of where this virus came from. And I think that's a complete reversal of what science is. There is no such thing as science without a debate and the free flow of information. That was extraordinarily harmful. It was even worse. This is a letter written by a very, very prominent scientist in the world of funding science. This was not written to me. It was written to one of my colleagues at Stanford, and I promised I would not say their name. But this is the email in June of 2021, and this person, who was very influential on all science careers, wrote and said, I've been following your romance with the far right wing in your campaign to trash Fauci. If you plan to stay in academe, please be careful about how your expertise and credentials are described. I mean, this is an overt threat to someone's career. This is what's going on in science. There is a sinful legacy of academia and public health, and the biggest legacy of all is the harm to the younger generation. This is a survey, this is of reported undesired weight change during the 2020 lockdown by age group. And a lot of us gained weight during the lockdown, but the younger generation, college-age students, 52% of them had an unwanted weight gain, and that weight gain averaged 28 pounds. Okay, that's a public health crisis. That's obesity when you put on 28 pounds. There's also a sinful loss of trust in public health, a politicization of public health guidance. This is a breakdown Gallup poll supporting K-12 opening schools by political party. And there's a huge difference here. 62% of Democrats support open schools, 94% are Republicans, and only 6% against. And I maintain this is a statement about the politicization of the whole discussion, rather than some kind of reflection on individuals. In addition, there is a backlash, an undermining of trust in what we all took for granted as being trustworthy. There are vaccines that are very important to take. There's no question about that. Now there's a backlash against all vaccines because of these nonsensical mandates about the COVID vaccine. And so we now have an arising of polio that has been documented. This is a secondary unanticipated consequence of using the power of government wrongly about vaccines and about stopping the flow of information about the vaccines. Because, of course, to get people to do things, as I said many, many times, it should be done by persuasion with the facts, as opposed to the way it was done with manipulating data, limiting data, trying to persuade the public. Now we see trust in science itself is severely politicized. This is the question, do you have a great deal of confidence in the scientific community by party? And you can see that for decades, there was no difference in Republicans or Democrats, for decades. And now, there is a huge difference. Republicans have a very, very low trust, say like 30% have a great deal of confidence, and Democrats more than double that. Why is that? I think we need to grapple with that. How do you restore trust? This is the last section of this presentation. And I think this is a big question because this is the challenge. It's not about statements on academic freedom, I can tell you that. This is Stanford 50 years ago has had a statement on academic freedom, and they said expression of the widest range of viewpoints should be encouraged, free from institutional orthodoxy and from external and internal coercion. These statements don't work. These emailed statements are worth the paper that they're written on. That's supposed to be a joke. Okay, this is what I think. It rests on individuals. Okay, we need people, good people, of which there are many, to step up, okay, to rise up. What do I mean by rise up? I mean speak up. As not only is it an opportunity in a free society, it's your burden, it's your duty to speak up. When my letter from the medical school people came out, none of the Stanford Medical School faculty stood up for me publicly. I got many emails behind the scenes and people stopping me saying, oh no, we agree with you, but we're afraid. Okay, but there comes a time when you can't be afraid. And Martin Kulldorff from Harvard Medical School wrote in and said, I'd be delighted to debate, if Atlas is right, with any of the 98 signatories. And guess how many took him up on that debate challenge? 0. We need institutional leaders to actually lead and have a spine. And why do I put this chart up? Because they're collecting big money for their jobs. This is the top 60 salaries of private college presidents in the United States. 60 plus make over $1 million a year. You know, that's okay, they don't want to put their salary in jeopardy, but I thought that a leadership, by definition, position means they're supposed to have leaders in those roles. Martin Luther King said there comes a time when we must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but one must take it because it is right. Political leaders have to speak up instead of cower and test the winds for votes. Back in 2020, when censorship mattered the most, YouTube, Facebook not only took down information, they bragged about it. Facebook is bragging here. They took 7 million posts down for spreading coronavirus misinformation between April and June of 2020. Governor DeSantis held a roundtable asked me, Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Koldorf, and Sunetra Gupta to talk about, in March of 2021, the pandemic and to answer questions. And here we are in Tallahassee, because we felt that opening the dialogue and answering the questions was the first step here. And we did hold that press conference, and it was taken down by YouTube as misinformation. This is the governor of Florida, live press conference with 4 people from a reasonably high level of knowledge, I'll say, and it was taken down. And what did DeSantis do? He called me up the next day. I won't forget it. And he said, Scott, we're going to have another press conference on the censorship. Because you can't give in, you can't give up, or the country's finished. And so we did a press conference, and that was held by 3 of us, Jay, Martin, and myself, talking about the censorship itself. That's the kind of person we need. We can't have people delegate authority and hide behind the CDC and say, we'll do whatever the CDC says. We also need to encourage outsiders to work in government temporarily as advisors, as overseers. I came in, I didn't care about the job. I told them what they were getting when they asked me to help, and if they didn't like it, I'm fine, I'm out of here. And so I brought in Jay Martin, Cody Meisner from Tufts, Joe Ladapo from UCLA. Why did I bring them in to see President Trump? To answer his questions. These were people doing the research on the pandemic. This was blocked, or attempted to be blocked, by people inside the White House. In fact, as soon as we sat down, I was handed a card in this meeting. 5 more minutes, Scott. Okay, so I thought, okay, well, at least I'm here, and we were there just answering questions. Isn't the job to give the president information to answer his questions? We want our leaders to be informed, particularly if you think that they're incompetent. Isn't that important for you to go in there and help? And so I'm answering these questions here, and of course, President Trump, being an inquisitive guy, went around and asked each one of us, and we were almost an hour in there. Okay, this is after being tapped on the shoulder several times saying, okay, Scott, wrap it up. Well, I'm not going to stop the President of the United States from asking the questions. We also need to hold universities financially accountable for freedom of information. Okay, this is a chart. There are more than 15 universities in the United States that get over $500 million per year, every year, from just the NIH alone. Okay, so number one, you sort of understand they're conflicted if they're going to criticize Fauci and Francis Collins at the NIH, because they think they're going to put their funding in jeopardy. But this centralization of money is a real problem, and we need to work on decentralizing the funding. We need to demand public apology for people who were wrong. Why? Not for private validation, but because if we don't have them publicly accountable, I'm afraid that they will do it again. And we need that publicly visible. We need to hold people who are defaming legally accountable. The way we have the situation in the United States, there's a very famous court case, New York Times versus Sullivan. You may have heard this. This is a precedent-setting court case that basically allows anyone to be defamed if you're deemed a public figure, even if you don't want to be a public figure. That means you have a high bar, and the bar of defamation is you must prove actual malice. Okay, that's proven to be almost impossible. So there's a lot of work intellectually in the law environment these days, maybe not at Stanford Law School, they're busy with other things, but it's not clear if this will hold up, that precedent. We need to form new institutions with moral authority. Myself, Jay Bhattacharya, and Martin Koldorf, under the leadership of Larry Arnn of Hillsdale College, have formed an Academy for Science and Freedom, which we feel, as Martin says, science is broken. We need to fix it. We need to fix the control of research, control of funding, and the censorship that's going on even in science itself. We've also I have formed a new policy institute focused on restoring the free exchange of ideas and liberty with my colleague from Stanford, Josh Rao, an economist, and we're working on doing things because the current institutions have failed, or we wouldn't be in the predicament we're in. And so we need new models with people who want action, and we're focused here on young people who are in their 20s and 30s, trying to educate them, mentor them, and let them know they're not alone when they care about freedom. They need to be able to navigate the world and still stay true to principles. Just to finish up here, what is the legacy that we're talking about? We're talking about the legacy of the biggest public health fiasco in modern history. Why? Because they caused avoidable death in society's most vulnerable. There was massive destruction of low-income families, particularly. There is still an ongoing enormous damage to our children. There is a severe loss of trust in public health and science. And lastly, their legacy, in my opinion, is there is a destructive societal division now present of people who think that everyone who disagrees with them is evil, is dangerous, and we have lost our basic civility. So I said this before, but why is this necessary to have public discussion of this and these congressional investigations, which of course by their very nature are political and are simply going to be discarded by many people. But we need a public record because, number one, ethical societies demand the truth. Number two, step number one in restoring trust is admitting error. Okay, we all know this from our personal experience in life. That's the first step. It's not sufficient, and I'm not naive to think it will come from these people, but I think we need to demand it, and only the public accountability will prevent the repetition of this heinous destruction. And so I want to finish with something that the young people, I give talks in a variety of places in the country, on college campuses, and young people who agree with this stuff say, but what can we do? And I say this, if nothing else, you must remember what Chesterton said, right is right, even if nobody does it, wrong is wrong, even if everybody is wrong about it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments. Anybody has any? Yes.
So if the Republicans take over in 2024, do you go back and go?
Yeah, the question is, if the Republicans take over in 2024, am I going to go back? You know, my initial reaction is, what are you, crazy? But, you know, I do say this, that it's particularly poisonous there. It's very difficult in Washington. I was a fish out of water. I was very naive. I'm not naive anymore. I would offer advice to anyone who asked me. It has nothing to do with political party. I think this was sort of a misconception of people about the politics of this. So I wouldn't say if the Republicans win. If anybody asked me, if President Biden asked me or anybody else, I would help. But to go back there, sort of in this mess, I think I'd have to think a long time before I said yes to that one. Yes. Your question is, why was Fauci allowed to continue, or? Yeah, the question is, why was Dr. Fauci allowed to be the face of it or so visible? Okay, so you're talking about in the Trump administration. So I got there August 1st of 2020. The task force had been functioning, if you want to use that word, since February 2020. Birx was the head of the task force since February 28th, 2020. So they had been in place for 5-6 months before I even walked in the door. And it was, why were they allowed to continue? Okay, so there's several parts of this, is sort of conjecture. Number one, Dr. Fauci had his own media operation going. And so that was not something that was controllable or not, even if somebody wanted to. And I don't think that was ever even attempted, really, to stop anyone. Dr. Fauci was not in charge of anything, really. He had no formal position. He was on the coronavirus task force, but his position in the NIH as a director of an agency was not subjected to that sort of thing. But the real answer to the question is this, that when I was speaking out, even though I was asked to help and brought in, I was told more than a half a dozen times in a row, stop talking, stop going to the press, don't rock the boat, an election is coming up. And my answer, to be polite, was the boat's already capsized and people are dying. I'm not going to stop talking. And it was a decision, is my point of that little anecdote, that there was an election coming up. Fauci and Birx had a positive public persona, and things were probably going to change after that. Okay, and I find that completely unacceptable. That is not appropriate. People were dying, the wrong things were being done. But that was what was happening. There was a political advisory sort of contingent that allowed that to happen. And of course, the failure of leadership by the person in charge, the President of the United States is supposed to be in charge to determine what's done. Yes.
Thank you so much for being here at a Catholic institution. And there are so many people here who are Catholic leaders or soon-to-be Catholic leaders, and we love our faith very much. We love what the Church speaks about, the discernment between good and wrong. And that is always something vitally connected to truth. And so this dialogue between science and faith is something we embrace rather than run from. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to what you would see as necessary for that continued dialogue so that, for example, for us as Catholics who have a very sophisticated and beautiful theology about the discernment between intrinsic evil, intrinsic good, and those matters which are prudential, being informed by the truth. How do we make this dialogue happen? And I'm thinking, for example, on specific cases. You know, if one might think about, for example, the Church's teaching on fertility and life issues and these sorts of things. Could you speak, for example, about what is known and versus what is unknown in a risk-benefit analysis when someone is approaching a prudential decision, something about fertility and the effect of vaccination, for example, on that issue?
So these are very big questions. There's no simple answer to any of this. But I will say the unifying theme, really, between what you just said and pure science itself is the truth. And the how do you arrive at the truth? That's the first step to having the discussion, really, or it's contingent on that. And that is, we have to fix we have to reinstate the scientific process itself, because science, pure science, is severely damaged. It's not even to the point of the communication of science to the public, let alone just with religion and religious leaders. We have two separate but related problems here, in my view. One is that internally in science, there is a problem with seeking the truth, being able to investigate toward the truth. That is science itself impeding its own mission. And then we have what has happened, which is, how does the public or anyone outside of pure science understand what's happening in science? And that vehicle is typically the media, okay, the people in the media or the media itself. And that has been completely broken. And that needs to be repaired. And I'll give you an example of that. The American media, specifically, versus non-American English-speaking media during the pandemic, 91% of stories about COVID were negative, quantifiably negative in the American media during 2020. 54% of non-American English-speaking media was quantified as negative. They had the same pandemic. There's been a gross failure, and I call it an ethical lapse, an ethical failure of the media to understand their importance to the public in translating science. So it's internal problems about the dialogue inside science to arrive at scientific truth, and also the translation of science to the non-science community, including religion. So I was just speaking with the Archbishop about these sorts of issues, and I think, we have to understand the value of truth. Instead of using science as a tool to convince people of things, we have to let people sort of understand the science. That's the role of translating science, in my view, to the public, is to interpret it so they understand the science, not to sway them about the scientific findings, and that has been broken. So the answer to all of this, really, and the long-winded nature of my answer, is that it's really all about transparency. The solution is more information, not less. We don't need to be worried about the danger of the information being expressed, which is what we've seen during this couple years in social media and elsewhere. We need to encourage and facilitate more dialogue, more, even more public discussion of these things, because I don't even know if most people understand what happened during the pandemic. Maybe everyone in this room understands, but it's not true when you travel. And so it's more information, more transparency. That's the essential, fundamental step before you can even get to how to translate it, and that has been lost. And that's a big threat to all of our freedoms and our existence, really, in what's supposed to be an ethical society. Two more.
Scott, you present a really compelling case that by June of 2020, certainly by September of 2020, there was a body of data and evidence that argued very clearly for alternative ways to manage the pandemic. Why did the powers that be, Fauci, Birx, and the like, in your opinion, why did they choose to ignore this set of facts?
Mm-hmm. I mean, the question why is the hardest question to answer, of course. This is my opinion. First of all, a huge amount of pressure happening during the time of the 2020 pandemic on people. They were elevated into not just a position of visibility, but they were given the authority. This is what happened. The CDC and these people were given authority that they should have never been given. They were literally just listen to whatever you say we're going to do. So that was a lot of pressure. They were... Okay, they came out of, there's several parts of this answer. They all came out of a specific scientific focus on AIDS. HIV and AIDS is the unifying link between Redfield, the head of the CDC, Fauci, and Deborah Birx. They all were cross-pollinating. Deborah Birx did a postdoc a year, I think, in both of their labs. Deborah Birx was in charge of the HIV/AIDS effort in Africa under the Obama administration and gave millions of dollars of funding to Redfield's lab on HIV. Fauci was all over HIV, saying the only thing that should be done is get a vaccine, by the way, if you have a tie to what happened here. And so they all had the same idea, and they were all in it together, which was a twofold problem, that specific tie. The twofold problem was, number one, it turned out they had a pact that if any of them were fired by President Trump, they were all going to quit. So there was a cabal. It was a troika, I called it in my book, that was motivated by their own survival rather than the facts. But secondly, they had this idea of transmission and what was appropriate. How do you stop the virus from spreading? Okay, well, you can't put a condom on and stop COVID. It doesn't work that way. It's spread by breathing. But they had a different mentality. Contact tracing in HIV and AIDS is a very appropriate tool because you can see who your partners were or whatever. It's not spread into millions and millions of people, in a single week period. And so they didn't understand this, in my view. And then the third part of the problem, which I didn't mention, I said it's only a two-part answer, is that I was the only one who came in with the data at the meetings. The meetings, I came in with 24 papers under my arm when I knew there was an agenda item to be discussed. They had no papers. They had no citation of data. They weren't in science. They were bureaucrats. And they had the mentality, in my view, of bureaucrats. And so when I would say, Vice President Pence would say, Scott, what's the risk to children? And I would go through the risk to children. And I would have the papers. I mean, I just literally cited the papers, and I had them. And you know, he would turn to them, and their only answer was either nothing, or they would say, well, he's an outlier to say that. That's it. And so there was no scientific discussion going on, and I think it's because their mentality, I mean, this is all my opinion, but their mentality was more of a bureaucrat as opposed to somebody really questioning, you know, in science you question what you know. That's the process. But they weren't in the process. They were bureaucrats for 30, 35 years. So it was a sort of a different mentality. And by the way, they were all in on the lockdowns, and they were supported by the media, by the way. And so human nature, it's very difficult to admit you're so wrong, and your advice not only was wrong, but people were dying. And that's just a human nature thing that I think is a very difficult position to be in. One more question.
Looking ahead, what do you, your colleagues, your research, your discussions, sort of like, where do you think this will all lead in the immediate future? Do you see COVID as something we have to live with like the flu, or something that we can get rid of like polio?
I mean, looking at the data right now, what you're looking at is you're seeing something become what's called endemic. Endemic means the virus is there, and it comes and goes in a less lethal form, and it's less destructive, and it's sort of there. And you can see, if you look at the cases over time, I was just looking at this actually, you see that there's an undulating wave of cases in the summer in some places and in the winters, and we're going to live with this. And that's because the virus has a reservoir. The virus doesn't disappear like some other rare viruses because there are animal reservoirs there. So it's going to be there, and it's going to be less lethal. And this is what's expected in a pandemic, is that the virus changes, it becomes less lethal, but it still is a contagious thing. And so yes, that's what's happening in the future. I anticipate there will be recommendations or mandates for vaccines. I'm not sure what the reaction to that will be. I don't think anybody knows at this point of that. And I think that we're in a perilous time on another front, and this isn't what you meant, but I'm going to put this out there, is that right now there's a discussion of something called the World Health Organization Pandemic Accord. And this is a document that is in draft form, and the Biden administration's WHO ambassador has come out and said, quote, we fully support the pandemic accord, unquote. Well, the pandemic accord, number one, isn't even finalized. So, I mean, I wouldn't agree to a contract that I didn't see. That's a problem. But the second part, the bigger part, is the World Health Organization in that document will define what a public health emergency is in your country for all the signatory countries. And because of that declaration of public health emergency, that means emergency measures will be able to be justified. And partly that document takes over part of the intellectual property of everything in your country for related to drug development, including drug prices to some extent. And why is that a problem? Well, because innovation thrives in the United States because of the incentives in the innovation model and in patent protection. So I think that's very complicated. I mean, not to mention the corruptness, the corruption in the World Health Organization proven by Tedros and the Director General, who, number one, lied about the cholera outbreak in Ethiopia before he took over because he was Ethiopia health minister. But during COVID in the end of January, he praised China as being the model for transparency. Okay, he went along with the stonewalling of the visits to the labs in Wuhan. He supported that, and it took him 3 years to finally come out against the lockdowns, and for over 2 years he was saying China has set a new standard for management with their, I'm adding this, barbaric lockdowns imprisoning their own citizens. Tedros is really not to be trusted, in my view. It's my opinion. Secondly, the World Health Organization's funding should be looked at. Because if they're in charge of stuff for your country, well, who controls them? It turns out that of the 80% of public payments, non-required payments supporting the World Health Organization, 80% are voluntary. When you take the philanthropic voluntary contributions, 88% come from one foundation, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And now that may be fine if that's in concert with your nation's views, but I'm not sure it is. It may or may not be in agreement with what your country should be doing. So I have to question why any sovereign nation would voluntarily give up this kind of power in a legally binding document to the World Health Organization, yet so this is the sort of bigger question of the sort of what's happening. That's what's happening right now. Okay, I think we'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Atlas, for that terrific talk. Thank you for being here at this juncture. We'd like to invite you over to our refectory for a reception, where Dr. Atlas will join us, as well as the Archbishop, I'm pretty sure. And so if you follow the seminarians, they'll point you in the right direction. You're going to go out these doors. You're going to go left out the carriage doors. These are carriage doors out here, the big white doors, and then over to the refectory right over here. We look forward to seeing you there in a moment. Thank you.